When the Bubonic Plague, better known as the Black Death, entered Europe from somewhere in the east in 1347, the major trading ports of Genoa and Venice introduced a Quaranta Giorni, a 40-day quarantine on arriving vessels from the east with whom they were actively trading. And that, of course, is the root of our English word quarantine. The first evidence of the plague is thought to have been at Messina on the east coast of Sicily, when a flotilla of Genoese galleys arrives from the Crimea, where they had a trading port. This map illustrates the spread of the disease over the next 4 years, from 47 to 51, leaving a few places strangely unaffected. Poland, or what is today Poland, being one of them, and of all the cities, Milan, which was the center of our current pandemic in Italy, was also unaffected, largely at least. This striking contemporary painting, created in 1349 by Gilles Mercy in Brussels, illustrates the horror which engulfed every community. In fact, this was a lucky community because at least they had coffins. Coffins quickly were no longer available. Neither were graves. Pits were where the bodies ended up. And in some cases, entire villages disappeared from the face of the earth. No one is exactly sure how many died. While the disease petered out by 1351, it kept reappearing at 10-year intervals. The original population of Europe before this started was around 85 million. Incidentally, whoever put this chart together, not me, who got the 80s and 90s mixed up there, was at 85 million. And that, by the time 1400 comes around, that was reduced to 60 million as a minimum. And in many cases, various commentators figure that half the population of Europe was lost at that time. And then it took 200 years, or rather, look at the preparers of this graph to say an insignificant moment, but 200 years or 3 or 4 generations before it's recovered to the 85 million. There is another blip, incidentally, in the mid-1600s, and that is attributed to the 30 Years' War in Germany, which is a subject for another day. So what were the subsequent effects on general activity, in construction activity in general? Well, remember that prior to this event, building was extremely active. There were 27 major cathedrals, such as Notre Dame de Paris, which wasn't one of the biggest, that were built in this period, conveniently completed, as you can see, before the plague hit Europe. And also at that time, they were very active building in defensive works, mostly castles. The 100 Years' War had begun between England and France. They were a very aggressive lot in the 14th century, always fighting one another. And so that was also good business for the construction industry, such as it was. The first effect of this was, of course, it was I should add, of course, that the construction labor was particularly hard hit. It was an itinerant workforce that moved from site to site, and as a result was very vulnerable to picking up any diseases that were going around. So the first effect in labor availability led to the abandonment of much construction. Here is Siena Cathedral. It's a beautiful cathedral, all in white and black marble. And they were in the process of, by the time it was completed just as the plague was arriving, but at the same time, they were actually active in expanding the cathedral to expand the apse and the transept. And the end result of everything was that they stopped construction, and not only stopped it for a few years, but stopped it in total. As you can see, here it is. If you go to Siena, it's not widely advertised as being what was to be the extension. In fact, it's being used as a parking lot. And those of you that have tried to park in Siena would know that's a very welcome addition to the central city there. So that second phase underway, but was left incomplete to this day. Even the famous Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, which had been under construction since 1292 of all times, was put on hold, partly due to the plague, but also because they could not figure out how to build that enormous dome. I did try to look for some kind of illustration that would show it without the dome, but couldn't find one. But just imagine that in your own minds, that the drum had been constructed, but not the dome was open now for a further 50 years or more. Next, of course, supply and demand being at work. This chart from British researchers illustrates the rates of pay over a 400-year period, which, if you can run your eye down to 1341-50, these are in 10-year increments, and the second column is the easiest one to read. The daily rate was 4 pence per day. Then just jump down 2 decades to 1370, and it's 1361-70. It's risen to 6 pence a day. That's a huge increase, a 50% increase in the period of 20 years or less. Well, as you can imagine, the authorities, being the state and the church, were shocked, and they tried to regulate with a statute, various statutes and bills and so on, to bring everything back to the original. They wanted everybody to be paid the same rate, the same conditions of work, and so on. But this was widely ignored. I'm sorry you can't read this, but even if it was, it's in a mixture of very early English and Latin. Is practically indecipherable. But anyway, it didn't have any effect because everybody simply ignored it. There were many effects, of course, on the economy in general, but from a building point of view, one of the biggest was on housing design. Here is the traditional medieval house on the right in 3 modules. On the right for the animals, in the center the kitchen with an open fireplace, and on the left the sleeping accommodations. And so this design begins to change. The animals are moved out to the barns. They had a vague inkling that there was some link between the animals and the disease, but they missed it because the main link was the black rats, who carried the fleas, which in turn carried the bacillus. But nonetheless, the rats, of course, were very active wherever animals were. So it was a good move. And it took time, of course, to get that done. Next change was building a chimney to keep the smoke out. Medieval medicine was very hung with the idea that any disorders were miasmic, were due to the atmosphere. And so getting the smoke out and clearing that was a good move as well. And the sleeping accommodations, separating them a little, giving more generous space and so on. So those changes begin to be brought in. Then, interestingly enough, quite shortly after the end of the plague had hit in 1351, even though it kept returning, as I've mentioned, there was a fair degree of construction activity, despite the lack of workforce to provide it. And this was especially in the area of the ecclesiastical work. This was a superstitious time, and people believed that if they gave money to the church, then that would save their souls in the afterlife. And so the church began to be the beneficiaries from the dead and from the living of large amounts of money, which were invested in various projects. This project on left is the wonderful hospice in Bowen in France. If you are ever there, get a chance to go, you really should go and see it. It's been wonderfully preserved. And that was completed in 1452. And then on the right, at long last, the money came available to build the dome in Florence, along with Brunelleschi, who solved the problem about how to do it. So let's just quickly summarize. This is obviously, as you can imagine, a pocket version of everything that was happening at this time to bring you the high points. So most of the effect was on construction labor, as we've seen, a severe shortage of craftsmen, experienced craftsmen. And what this led to was that younger craftsmen began to come into began to be promoted from the various workplaces and guilds. And they were less experienced nonetheless, but they did fill the bill. And there was a relaxation of the guild rules that allowed apprentices to qualify as journeymen a little earlier and journeymen to apply as a master craftsman a little earlier as well. The pay increases, of course, raised the price of general building. We've seen that. And because of that, there was also more standardization, I've called it here, in the craft workshops. Prior to this time, a lot of the stonework was worked partly at the quarries and partly in the workshops of the craftsmen at the building site. And each craftsman, each mason particularly, had his own set of templates, which were kept very secretively. And he did his own moldings and so on. Now we begin to see much more standardization in the work of columns, of window and door frames and so on. And these were done either in the workshops on site or occasionally, in the case of Florence in particular, had a thriving business in selling these stone objects to builders to be incorporated into their buildings. Other factors listed there are, we've talked about delays to projects inevitably and abandonments, the housing design and availability. As you can imagine, there were a lot more housing available because of the sheer number of people that had died. And this eventual resumption of ecclesiastical and defense works. I think the housing redesign is kind of quite interesting because one of the questions arising from when we study history is what effect is this likely to have on us today and the future? And I think a lot of us are concerned about what will be the effect of our current pandemic on design and construction. And almost certainly it's going to have an effect on housing. We're going to have much more space set aside for in-house, for housing, for doing your work at home instead of on the kitchen table or the dining room table, if you're lucky. And this will lead to different arrangements for accepting deliveries, many other changes, I think, that are likely to take place, including a diminution in the demand for office space and retail space. And I think that will lead us to seeing the modification, the repurposing of office buildings and retail space for other purposes, including housing. One thing I forgot to mention was that the expansion of the defense works were handled by increases in taxes. And what was going on prior to the arrival of the plague and as a subsequence of the plague was a breakdown of the feudal and manorial system of the relationships between labor and their masters. So the plague is over. They begin to tax the new population to be able to build these defense works and fund their campaigns. And this in turn eventually leads to the big peasants' revolt in 1381 in England and subsequent ones in Europe as well. That and other economic and societal changes were also affected by this great plague. So thank you. Any questions, I'll be happy to answer. But in the meantime, back to you, Peter.
All right, thank you, Brian. Somewhat chilling, I might add, to be thinking about this and how it relates to present time. The past maybe is not so different from the present.